Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining our How to Thrive While Leading Through Change webinar. My name is Sarah McChesney and I will serve as your host today. Please feel free to send us any questions during the webinar and our expert will be happy to answer them at the end of his presentation. You will find the question area in the top right-hand corner of your screen within the control panel. But for now, please let me introduce you to today's presenter. Brent Borgenvog is a human resource development specialist and professional coach. For over 16 years, Brent has been working with people at all levels of an organization, from frontline employees to senior executives and leaders. He specializes in the areas of leadership effectiveness, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence-related skills development. Brent once worked as an IT professional, but his passion for helping others further develop their soft skills brought him to where he is today. With no further ado, I bring you Brent Borgenvog.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning and welcome. I guess it's good afternoon and welcome, everybody. So we're going to be talking about change, and today's focus is, of course, on leadership and leading through change. So how do we help others handle change, and how do we bring about change successfully? But that's not to say that if you're not a leader or you're not in an official leadership position, there won't be something for you in here in terms of how you can help yourself and help those around you deal with change and actually thrive in change. So I thought I'd start off with this little image of like, what does change look and feel like? And so when we start to think about change, you know, what does it look like? What does it feel like is often different than how we're told it should look like. We get this linear model, we're here today, we're going to be there tomorrow, but it often looks more like this. And things happen and, you know, it all happens and goes, and then all of a sudden, here we are. And so if you look at this picture, you think, okay, the triangle at the bottom, that's where we are today. That's where we are now. And there are internal and external forces that are affecting us and causing us to think about moving towards a desired future. But there are a lot of transition states that happen between where we are right now and getting to that desired state. And so that's where the leadership comes in. And so when I think about change, automatically in my head, I start to think about leadership, because the more change we're faced with, or the more change that we have to deal with, the more people need help with change, the more we need leadership. When we don't have so much change, we don't really need leadership. We need kind of more manager type of role. So leadership and change are really, to me, very synonymous and connected. And so what we need is leadership that when we're in that transition state, it'll feel like we're moving forward. It'll feel like we're moving backward. It'll feel like we're spinning our wheels. But that's where we need a leader who really stands up and says, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what how we're going to make this successful. So how we deal with change, or how we think about change, let's start about our perception with change and how we think about it, is dependent, it's subjective, right? So it depends on how you look at it. So for many of us, you know, did I initiate the change? If we are looking at change, we're probably more change friendly, or we are more positive about the change if we initiated the change, especially if we stand to benefit, or we perceive that we stand to benefit from that change. We're going to look at change as a more favorable type of thing. You know, one of the things that people say a lot is they don't like change, or change is scary. And I think that, you know, it really depends on how you think about it or how you see it. For a lot of us, we actually really like change because we feel we're going to benefit from it. We feel we're going to get something out of it. We feel that it can be positive. So we can go in with a positive outlook. And so keeping that mind frame is going to be important. On the other hand, if the change is being done to me, or I have no choice in the matter, or it's just happening, I have no involvement, no engagement, oftentimes the sense of perception about change is negative. That's especially true if we're in situations where change has, for example, been tried before and failed, or we get told something and what actually happens isn't anything related to it, and other people benefit, but I don't seem to benefit. So at that point, we get people who are maybe cynical or skeptical. They're not that change friendly. Oftentimes, they're just waiting for the change, the big change thing to kind of happen and pass them by. So people keep their heads down, they don't engage, and they sort of just wait for it to pass. Because a lot of times when you look at big change initiatives, there's a lot of hoo-ha at the beginning. There's lots of talk about it. There's lots of meetings and discussions and all of that. But over a period of time, when there is a lack of leadership, we often see that those change initiatives fail because people get very excited about the change at the beginning, but over a period of time, they often don't keep in mind how much work needs to go into sustaining that change and making it happen. So another factor, if we think about, how people think about change, is our personality. And so I do a lot of work with people in terms of personality assessments. You may have had one done with you. The one that I use is by DISC, and it divides people into 4 quadrants. And if you've had the assessment and the debrief, you're going to know similar things that I'm talking about here. So for example, some people, their personality is anchored in, they like change, they like moving forward. And so those styles, the D and the I, if you're familiar with DISC, are often about, invoking change, bringing in change happening. Sometimes in a more negative sense, they're about change just for the sake of change. And so other people who are less change friendly or less enthusiastic about change often become weary of the change because it doesn't seem like the change has a purpose. So if you're in that group where you love change, you love moving forward, that's great. You're going to help to initiate change. The challenge there is going to be, how do I sustain it? How do I keep this working forward? Other styles, though, and I'm not going to be comprehensive in this at all, but I'm just sort of pointing out some key ones. Some styles, maybe they fear making a mistake. So that's what's really holding them back. So it's not necessarily the change that's the factor. It's the fact that they're afraid of doing it right. And so, for example, when you think about that, the fear of not being able to appear competent, the fear of not being able to do a good job is often the driver in terms of reluctance to change. It's not so much the change itself, but it's the person's perception of themselves and how they're going to look in this change. We also have some people who are not that, they're a bit fearful of the unknown. When they don't know what's going to happen, they don't know how it's going to play out, they tend to be more cautious. It's not necessarily a fear of change per se. It's just that they don't know what's going to happen. And so when we think about these personality factors and we think about the people that we're leading, we can also make allowances for personality factors and how we're going to engage them. How do we make them successful? So when I think about leadership and I think about change, my goal as a leader is about how do I make the people involved in the change successful. That's my goal. It's not about making me successful. It's about making them successful. And just as another example here about personality factors, there are some people who really need to have lots of rules and guidelines. They need to understand things. They have to have these things before they're willing to move forward. And sometimes you'll see even there's personality style clashes. For example, those who love change and love moving forward are generally the kind that don't need a lot of rules and guidelines. And so it's easy to forget that other people might need those rules and guidelines. So as you're thinking about yourself and change and those that you're leading in change, give some thought to their personality styles, what they need, and how you can go about making them successful. There are other factors as well. If you've ever looked at decision-making and behavioral economics, you can understand that these can kind of play into how we deal with change, how we perceive change, how we engage in change. For example, there's a preference for the status quo and inertia that says, you know what, if I have to really work hard at this, I don't want to do that change necessarily. I kind of like things the way they are right now. I understand them. And that will even affect, for example, people may know that things are not necessarily the best that they can be right now, but I don't have to invest any energy in doing it. So I'm going to just keep with what we are right now. Time discount. I have this situation right now. I can do it. Again, it might not be the best, but I don't want to invest in the future because I don't know what that future is going to look like. This is a big one, and loss aversion is something that you really need to consider when you're leading change, and that is people will pay more attention to what they fear they are losing or what they perceive they're losing, even if what they're losing is less than what they're gaining. So for example, when I learned this, the example was, you'll pay more attention to 25 cents that you lose than $5 that you gain. And that's just simply a factor of how we look at things, or we often look at things. And then we also need to consider, for example, how do we go about as leaders giving positive reinforcement and feedback to people as they progress through the stages of change. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on, is like, what are those stages and how do we actually reinforce and move positively through that? So there's a variety of factors that affect our perception. We need to be aware of those, and we need to plan how we're going to step up and lead change. Another thing to be aware of, and I don't know if you've ever seen Simon Sinek's excellent video on why. He uses this example. So he talks about where people sit on basically a standard bell curve. And so when you think about change, you want to think about, where do I focus my efforts, and sort of where am I aiming to engage people? And so you're going to have early adopters. These are people that they're on board early on. They think change is great. They're right there. And if you think about technology, I was just having a conversation with a couple of the other organizers before, and we were talking about how, some of us are more early adopters and some of us are further down the curve. And so you know who you are. You're the ones who stand in line, you order the first generation of everything, you think it's exciting, but you're like basically 2% of the population. Then we have the fence sitters. These are the kind of people, this is the 13.6% group. And they're they watch the early adopters as things get a little bit more settled, maybe prices come down, a little bit better understanding. They kind of get interested and they kind of get on board. And so as a leader, for example, you don't really need to focus on the early adopters because they're on. You want to think about the fence sitters, and then you want to think about the vast majority. This is that 68% in the middle. They will get on board once they're convinced things actually work. They will start. They will be part of it. Now, the thing that you want to focus on is this little sort of tipping point, it's called. So somewhere the fence sitters reach this certain point, and once they start to engage the vast majority, then you start to be able to sustain change. And so as a leader, you're thinking about, how do I engage my fence sitters and how do I focus on using that on my vast majority? If you focus only on your early adopters, you're talking to people who are basically bought in, and they often don't have a lot of credibility with the group you're trying to influence. So this is how you're using your influence, which is specifically that vast majority. No change is going to sustain until you've got the vast majority engaged. And that's really that tipping point that you have to be thinking about, and you have to be having a sense of, where am I relative to this? Then you have the group that's late to the table. This is that 13.6% on the other side of the curve. And they're like waiting, and okay, once I see that all these other people are on board, okay, well, I better get on board. And then of course you've got this never gonna do it group, this 3% at the top. And in Simon's video, he says, this is the group that still, if they had rotary phones, that's what they would have. They're annoyed because they have to have push button phones because they still can't get rotary phones. So thinking about the group of people that you need to be engaging and where they are relative to sustaining change is going to be really important. And then we look at this little map here, which says, okay, so what do we have to be aware of when we want to be successful at implementing change? We want to not get stuck. And so when we start having change happen, we start to get into this stage at the beginning, which is this past focus, what we're losing. Oh, I don't want change. No, I don't want change. And we see that this line here is kind of talking about productivity. And you'll see that a focus shifts from us, the group of us, what we're trying to accomplish, to me. And it's down here when we're in the me that we have to sort of say, okay, so now what happens if we start to move forward? And that's that exploration box. And so our goal as a leader is to keep people moving and focused on the forward. If we spend too much time focusing on the past, what we do is we get stuck in this valley, and it's called sometimes the valley of despair. And so then you think about that future commitment, and then we think about how do we move forward. And then as we move forward, we'll see that our productivity and our engagement increases as people become more committed to the change. And so what specifically do we do to move out of that me focus to the future focus? We can look at this little change curve here. And so I was thinking today about, a lot of us are dealing with a lot of change right now. The COVID-19 factor has, if we think about, working from home, leading remotely, dealing with people in new situations, boy, we're on a change curve for sure. And so we start with the idea of awareness. I want to do something. I want to bring about a change. And that's followed perhaps by interest. And so for a leader, awareness came back in March when we all had to start working from home. And now we started getting interested in, okay, well, how do we get better at working from home? How do I lead groups remotely? Before we were kind of in survival mode. And now we're at this sort of trial stage where we're trying different things. We're Zoom meeting, we're doing all these different things. But that doesn't mean that the change has been implemented. That just means that we're at the trial stage. And the thing about the trial stage is that it has this high potential for failure. And also a lot of times when we think about why change fails, why change doesn't work, is because we get to that trial stage, there's a failure and people go, oh yeah, it's not going to work. And they just give up. What we want to do is get onto that adoption phase so people start getting involved, and then we can get into that sustain phase. And that sustain phase is also a place where there is potential to fail. So if you think back about where are we right now with a pandemic and leading people remotely, we're at the trial phase. We're trying new things. We're trying different ways of working together as a group. As we get more experience, as we try different things, we're going to get into the adopting phase where we're going to adopt new practices, new behaviors, and then we have to look at how do we move to sustain that. And so what happens when we start to change? In times where we have stability, we have sort of three areas of focus. There's the me, the I, there's the us, the group, and then there's the it, which is the work that we're doing. And we can see that that's kind of balanced. We think about ourselves, we think about our work group, and we think about the productivity. If you think about it, it's really the productivity level. But when we start to get change happening, here's what happens. We start to sort of see that the I focus becomes much, much more important. The us focus becomes a lot smaller, and the it focus becomes very small. And so when we think about how do we handle change, unless we deal with refocusing that I focus, we're not going to get to the us and it. And of course, when we look at change and we look at what we're trying to accomplish, what we really mean is we're focusing on the it. And so how do we rebalance that equilibrium? How do we find ways to bring that back into a neatly balanced I, us, it focus? So here are some things to think about doing that are going to get you there. So our leadership objectives. The first thing we have to do, and the most important thing as a leader, is we need to engage. We need to engage with individuals, so that's one-on-one with our team members, and we also need to engage with the group as a group. So the thing we have to do there is think about, so how do we make our conversations about change safe? How do we allow people who are unsure or scared or afraid? Maybe we're dealing with people who they don't want the change because they don't know that they're going to be competent in that change. How do we allow them to have that discussion? So this is really in terms of the climate that you as a leader communicate. And so you want to be communicating constantly. You want to have a focus on moving forward, but it's a focus. This is not pushing, okay? This is not you standing behind people, they're digging their heels in and you're pushing them forward. This is you're engaging them so that they start to take those steps forward. And once they feel safe, once they feel that there's two-way dialogue, they're going to feel that they're able to start going up that curve and moving more towards that exploration and trial phase. The other thing you want to think about is the fact that you're going to have new group norms happening through that change. And especially right now with COVID, we've got new group norms. You know, we're all adapting to social distancing, for example. We're all adapting to all of these different things that we have to do in terms of how we behave. And so as a leader, this is a conversation that you want to have in your group. You want to talk about things like, how are we working? How is it effective? What's working for us? What's not working? And here again, you know, just because a norm existed before and it's not working now, we can get rid of it. We can change that. We can add new norms that support moving forward. So how are the team norms that are going to help us? Maybe there are some new ones that we can add, and especially look at our team in terms of how they're behaving and reinforce the ones that are working. As a leader, this means you have to really have good communication with your group, and you really have to have a sense of where the group is. Now, when you have the eyes on, for example, you're able to watch your group work, you have a much clearer ability to detect this. Right now, if you're in a remote leadership situation where, you know, you're not necessarily seeing people behave, you're going to have to rely on that communication, and that's why you have those important conversations, not only with the group, but with individuals in the group. The other thing that you have to find is a way for people to become active in the change. So this is going to help them feel it less so that the change is being done to them. This is especially important if you have some of the more passive controller personalities, people who are less likely to volunteer, more likely to stand on the outside and criticize and point out failures. You're also going to see that they're more reluctant to move forward. And so by finding a role in terms of making them engage, giving them some responsibility, giving them some role in making it successful, you're going to find that it's much easier to move change forward. And I guess that's also a reminder, right? Like a lot of leaders think about the change means they got to do all the work. And in reality, when you're trying to lead through change, you're trying to find important roles for every member of your team that engages them and gets them to move forward. It's not you doing the work. You're finding the right people, you're finding the right role, you're encouraging them, you're observing their behavior, you're giving them positive feedback, you're there helping them when there's failure, you're helping them refocus on moving forward. And so what that means is we start to look for, how do we find ways to show that we're actually moving forward? There is this thing about change around the idea that you need to create an urgency. Okay, so when you read about change management models, you'll see that often there are statements about, how do I create urgency? And that's important, but again, it's not forcing. It's about creating a sense of a need to move forward. And as you create that sense of needing to move forward, the idea that you point out that these are some of the successes, these are the things that we've accomplished, starts to reinforce any new behavior, any new norms that are happening with the group. And so again, being observant and maybe even, you know, creating some early successes that are, you know, you can think about, okay, well, if we do this, we're going to get success early. That's going to help reinforcing. If you've ever been on a diet or tried to do anything to change your own behavior, like maybe quit smoking or something, you'll know the value of this, right? If you eat diet food and you're exercising, you're doing all this kind of stuff, and you see nothing happen, then you're going to say, oh, forget it, doesn't work. But if you start exercising and then you start to see, oh, you know what, some pounds are falling off and I feel better, I feel fitter, whatever, that's going to reinforce your desire to continue those changed behaviors over a period of time. Now, the other thing to think about is that it's not a matter of if failure is going to happen, it's more about when is failure going to happen. And again, if you're a leader and you have to think about your own response to that, if you're somebody who doesn't like failure or doesn't encourage it and you react negatively to that failure, what you're going to do is reinforce with the people that you're trying to lead in the change that don't try and change, because when I fail, I'm just going to upset the leader. So if you think about, this little graphic here, fail is first attempt in learning, thinking about that failure, what can you do to make yourself stronger? How can you get it right the next time? What can you learn? There's a lot to be said around creativity and innovation, especially if we're trying to bring about creativity and innovation in the change that we're trying to lead. So how we look at failure, how we manage failure, how we help our team through failure starts to become really important. And that means we have to be able to frame or reframe the change. And so here we see that, the little conundrum, the glass is half full or it's half empty. And so as a leader, we need to be thinking about how do we frame the change or reframe the change. So it might be relative to, for example, a failure or about how we're going to move forward. But if you're thinking about that, we've only got a few minutes left, so I thought I have some questions that you can discuss with your team when you're starting to think about how do we deal with change and how do we move forward. So these are 4 questions that you can think about and have a discussion with your team. When you walk out of this, when you walk away from this webinar, you can have this discussion this afternoon with your team and you can ask them these 4 questions. First question, what could we not do before that we still can't do now? So this is often, I can be facetious and say, well, we couldn't break the law before, we still can't break the law now. Nothing's changed. Couldn't do that before, still can't do it now. Now, I'm using, if you think about it, a more backward focused, anchored in the present. Still can't do it. What could we do before that we can't do now? So here is a backward focus. So people who, this is talking about loss aversion. And people oftentimes, when you do this, what you want to do is actually write it down so that they can see it. And then you don't want to get stuck here. Write it down and move on. We couldn't do this before, or we could do this before, but we can't do it now. Okay, so let's look at the more positive. What could we do before that we still can do now? And what can we do now that we couldn't do before? Those last 2 questions, question number 3 and question number 4, are going to be the questions that propel your discussion and focus on moving forward and taking action. So these 4 questions are something that you can have with your team right away. And if you're struggling with change, this is a way to get them refocused on moving forward. So the last part I wanted to talk about deals with how do I sustain the change? And this is important because what I see in terms of leadership initiatives, lots of people get excited about the change, but what they fail to take into account that change takes time. Change doesn't happen overnight. And so we then need to look at how do we sustain our efforts to change? And it's more like a staircase, we're moving up, or maybe that curve. We're moving up gradually, we're moving up gradually, we're going to take 2 steps back, we're going to move up gradually, we're going to move up gradually. And so for you, the leader, that means that you have to have the ability to sustain and support, and you have to have the endurance to be able to do that. And so you want to think about what are the changes in the system, what are the changes in your organization that you need to put into place. Strategy, goal change. How do you reward behavior, right? If you're going to try and sustain change and you're focused more on, let's say, for example, you want to get more team effort, you want to get more people working together. An example of systemic change would be not rewarding individual performance as much as how do I find measures of way to measure group performance and reward a group as a whole. So a lot of times, when I worked at the bank years ago, we had this issue. We tried to We got individual performance in terms of process improvement, and then we wanted to move that more towards a team achieving process improvement. What we didn't do at the time, and we discovered wouldn't help sustain the change, was we didn't evolve how we recognized and rewarded performance, and we were giving individual performance recognition and rewards versus team recognition and rewards. Same thing, if you think about how do I reward those individuals who are doing a really good job, they keep their head down and they excuse me, and they deliver constantly. You want to find to recognize them, but a lot of our recognition systems and processes recognize heroics. So look at your systemic ways of, what's going to help me in my change, what are going to get in the way of making my change. And this is where you as the leader need to come in, because the people who are doing the change can't make these changes. You're the one who has to make the changes for them. You have to make it easy for them to succeed. So I want to be mindful of our time, but I'm wondering if anybody has any questions. So do we have any questions, Sarah?
We do, and I'll just remind everybody that if you have any questions that you haven't entered yet, please do so in the question area of the control panel to the right of your screen. But the first question I have, Brent, is how can you tell where someone is along the change curve?
That's a good one. The best way to do it is to set things with which that person can engage. So if you, for example, maybe it's about information, or maybe it's about doing something, and then you look and wait and see who does it. So for example, when I was working at the bank, I used to work in corporate and public affairs, and one of the things that we did was we had an acquisition of another financial services company. And I wanted to know where people were relative to taking action. So where were they in terms of understanding what was happening and then looking at what they could do? So we would put information up on the internal website, and then I could measure who was looking at different pieces of information. And as people got more interested in certain topics, you would see that the number of people looking at different topics became higher. So then I knew people were starting to engage. And then you would set things like, so do they do certain things? Do they engage in certain behaviors? They're very simple little things that you can set up. But once you see people start to interact with information or ask questions or do something, then you've got a sense of where they are. And then you start to talk to them about how they feel about the outcome. And you look at them in terms of, do they have a sense of mastery? Do they have a sense of accomplishment? It's not that hard to do, but what it means is we really need to be observant and have some measures of behavior. So what's the behavioral change that we want to see happen? And how can I detect, or how can I observe that behavior?
Great. I have a few more questions for you. How long can I expect it to take to successfully implement change?
Good question. So when you start to look, it depends on the number of people, obviously. So if you're trying to change the behavior of 5 people versus 5,000, the more people, the longer the change is going to take. But change generally takes at least 6 months to a year to happen. And so, one of the challenges is that people start to see early success and they feel that the change has been accomplished, and then they move on. And that's when you see the failure, and people feel that they've been abandoned. I work with organizations a lot on cultural change and how do they implement cultural change. Usually, and those are small organizations or big organizations. In those cases, we're talking like at least a year. So I think it's interesting. Lots of people get very excited about change, or they want to see change happen really quickly. But the reality of the fact is it takes at least 6 months, and it's more likely a year to a year and a half before we see any sort of sustainable change. And if you just look at sort of what's happening now, even around social distancing, people have followed the guidelines, they followed the rules, but now they're getting tired of it. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. And so they're giving it up. And so if we want to really sustain the change around, how do we interact with people, it's going to take about a year before people start to re-norm and realign how they interact with people. So it takes about 6 months to a year. And even then, even at about a year, it's going to take a little bit longer still. But don't get discouraged. I don't mean that to be discouraging, okay? What I mean by that is that it's a gauge for you to plan and keep aware of how long do you need to be communicating? How long do you need to be interacting with people? How long is it before, you can move on to another topic, right? The thing you need to be very careful about is also change fatigue. Like if you don't allow one change to really get anchored in the organization, you bring about another change, there's only so much change that people can handle. So again, you start to look at, a good example is how different governments have been handling the questions and the situation around social distancing and dealing with other people around COVID. When you start to see messages around change, okay, masks are good, no, masks aren't good. Oh yeah, maybe masks are good. People they don't know what to pay attention to, and then they get tired of it and they just do what they want to do. So the idea around change is you want to be mindful of it, you want to be purposeful, and you don't want to overload people with too many contradictory messages, and you don't want to add more and more changes on top of ones that are already happening. So just be mindful of that.
Thanks, Brent. I have another question, a great question. When do you stop pushing the team to change? My team is very rigid, and I'm wondering if I will upset them by pushing too hard.
So pushing too hard, that's a good concern, because what they're hoping is by pushing against you, they're hoping that you say, you know what, it's not worth it, you're going to give up. So what you need to do is keep at it. But again, it's not like hammering at it. It's not like, okay, change, bang, 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 bang. It just starts to become something that doesn't go away. And it starts to be something that you may even need to sort of start to escalate. You may need to look at sort of, how do I start to make, some of the behaviors not possible to do anymore. Sometimes you need to, allow things that say, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. That's not going to happen. And you're going to have to start engaging. Usually, like with a lot of IT people, what I see is that, especially with technical people, they're going to resist the change. They fall into that personality style that's like, wow, they just resist, 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 resist. It's often passive aggressive style. And what it means is you as the leader need to say, you know what, I'm not going to go away. Slow and steady. Just keep working at it, keep working at it, keep working at it. Engage, engage, engage. And once they feel safe to voice their concerns, you're going to start to see that they'll start to change their behavior. But that's going to mean really that they have to feel safe to have the discussion about what is the resistance. I would suggest, if your team is pushing against you, sit down and go over those 4 questions we talked about earlier. I think that might open up a really good discussion with your team and you around what are the fears and what are the anxieties.
Brent, you spoke about the latecomers to change. How can someone convince latecomers to participate?
Well, so there's a couple of strategies to think about, and it's like, so we're talking about, I'm assuming latecomers is the people who are sort of the less early adopter kind of stage. And so a lot of times what we can do with that group is we allow the other people, that middle group, to work on them. So sometimes, like, rather than us trying to affect them directly, we put them, we engage them with other groups. So I might want to look at setting a project or setting a task for a group of people to do, and I'll do it as a group effort, come up with something new or come up with something different. And then I'll put those people who are maybe a little bit late adopters together with some of the people who have not so much the early adopters, because they're just going to turn them off, but some of the middle of the road people, people who have some credibility within the team. And if you look at your team and you think about people in your team, you're going to realize, and you probably already know this, like some of those people have a little bit more credibility, have a little bit more influence than others. And so how I set up working groups of people that have different levels of credibility and influence over others is often the key. So I'm thinking about, how do I put certain people together and put them on specific projects that have a certain outcome that we're looking to achieve that's going to move that change forward? How do I engage them and put them together? And they're going to do the work themselves. They're going to start to recognize, oh, okay, and they're going to start to engage. I was going to say, it's just a bit like, if your parents ever said to you, wait till you're a parent, you're going to see what this is like. It's almost a bit like that. All of a sudden, you've got kids of your own. You're going, oh my goodness, I know what they meant by that now. So it's like just a matter of reframing the situation and putting them into a new situation with people who have a broader view or a different view of the change.
Thanks, Brent. And I have one last question. So by all means, if anyone else wants to squeak one in, we still do have some time. But the last one I have at this point is, we talked about the fear of failure, Brent, but how do you handle failure?
Personally or as a leader?
Well, as a
Those
leader.
are two different answers, maybe sometimes. So how do I handle failure? So the first thing is to avoid blame, right? And to avoid shame. So, statements like, what were you thinking? Or, of course, that's not going to work, are absolutely going to tell that person it is not safe to fail. As a leader, the question that I like to ask around failure is not so much, why did this fail, but what did you want to accomplish? What was the goal? And then we start to look at sort of what, focus is on moving forward, the goal. And then we say, okay, so what did we learn from this failure? What do we know doesn't work? Now that we know that that doesn't work, let's think about what are the things that we could do that might help us overcome this, but also achieve that particular objective. So what happens with the failure is that people focus more on the failure itself and on what happened and why it happened. You certainly want to understand why it happened, because maybe sometimes there's a structural issue or a problem with the why part. But a lot of times, that turns into a blame game, and people are just, they're shamed into sort of why they made a particular decision. So think about, okay, so what was the person trying to accomplish, or what was the group trying to accomplish? Refocus on what that objective or goal is, and then look at, are there other ways that we can do this, or what can we learn from that failure that we can take forward? How can we build on that failure? So it's a mindset. And of course, like for myself, I happen to be more of that mindset that pays more attention to loss and failure. And I'm more of a person who might blame. But when I'm in the role of a leader, what I need to do is remember, this is not about me. This is not my failure. This is the team that I need to make successful. And so let's look at what that failure was. Let's refocus on what we're trying to accomplish. And let's look at what are the new things that we can try and do to become successful.
That's
it just
great,
means
Brent.
stepping back from the failure itself and moving on to, so what can we do now?
Well, that concludes all the questions, Brent. Do you mind putting up the final slide? Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to remind everybody that we do edit this recording and send it out to everybody who registered. along with the PowerPoint slide deck. So that will be coming out in the next week or so through email. But on the screen in front of you, you're going to see a list of 2 classes that are upcoming leadership courses taught by Brent, and the next scheduled dates for those. So for any of you who would like to explore some more leadership training, Brent has been teaching our leadership classes for quite a few years now, and they are absolutely fabulous. So highly recommend those.
So Sarah, I just want to make a mention here. So the 2 classes that are up here, so the Masterful Leadership and Motivation for IT Professionals, which is July 13, 14, 15, and October 26, 27, and 28. Those first 3 days are the same 3 days when we look at the Leadership Development Workshop, which you'll see also starts 13, but it's 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So that's a 5-day. The workshop is a 5-day course, which starts off with the first 3 days of Masterful Leadership and Motivation. So in that Masterful Leadership and Motivation, we talk about, people get an assessment about their personality styles. We talk about motivation. We talk about all the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of behaviors and focus as we want to develop as a leader. And the focus is on how do we lead and motivate others? How do we work through others, lead others, and motivate others? The Leadership Development Workshop adds 2 things to that. So on the 16th, we talk about what's the communication, what are the communication aspects of leadership? So leadership is very, very important, in terms of being an effective communicator, but it's different than being an individual communicator. So we look at what are the communication issues and things that are important for a leader. And then on the 17th, which is the 5th day, is where we talk about feedback and coaching. So we build on the communication part, we build on the motivation part, we build on all the behaviors of leadership, and we wrap it up very nicely by talking about how do I coach people, how do I give them feedback, how do I engage people. So if you're looking at sort of the full thing, that 13, 14, 15, and 16th of July, and 26, 27, 28, 29, 30th of October, that's the full workshop, but the first 3 days are the same as that Masterful Leadership and Motivation for IT Professionals. So sometimes people get confused about, like, they see the same dates and they wonder, like, what's the difference? So I just thought I would point that out.
That's great. Thanks, Brent. And these classes have been taught virtually, live instructor led for some time now. So for those of you working remotely and taking classes virtually, this is not a new thing for us to be delivering these types of courses that way. And Brent is very good at being able to interact via a virtual training class. So.
No, sorry, I was going to say, Sarah, I didn't mean to talk over you, but I was just going to say, if I think about my own personal change, one of the changes that I've been dealing with lately has been, how do I move all my in-class teaching, which is often very much about a discussion with a group, and how do we keep the conversation flowing and explore ideas and case studies. So that's been a big change that I've been going through. And I'm happy to say that it's where I want it to be. So we're doing it virtually. We still have the same conversations. We still have the group interaction. So so that's been a good change for me, and now I'm looking to sustain it. So.
And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the toll-free number. If you have, you can register online on our website at protectraining.com. But there's also a toll-free number as well as an email address if you have any questions. And the resource tab on our website is also a great place to find the upcoming webinars and past webinar recordings and some variety of articles. And I am happy to mention that Brent will be back to do another free webinar for us back in mid-September. And that time we'll be talking about strengthening your communication skills, which of course is very in close family with the leadership that we're talking about today. I was just going to thank everybody for joining us today. And also, Brent, a big thank you for taking your time out again to share your leadership expertise with us all.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and it's been fun. It's been fun doing this. I am totally passionate about leadership, and when I look at what's happening around us right now at so many levels, it's now is a time where leaders can shine. And I think that, especially, I think one of the most neglected areas around leadership has been in the IT world. It's been very much in terms of business development and other lines of business, but I also think that there are a lot of opportunities up for grabs for IT leaders. And so if you're thinking about becoming a leader, or if you are an existing leader and you want to advance your leadership career, invest in yourself, invest in your leadership. I think there's going to be a tremendous need for that as we move forward. And it's going to mean that there's a lot of opportunity for people with IT experience and the desire to bring that together with leadership skills and ability. So there's a lot of opportunity in the IT world for leadership, and I hope people are able to recognize that and step up and take it.
Very, very important point, and well said, Brent.
So I will let everybody go back to their regularly scheduled day right now. And hopefully I'll see you in some of the classes coming up, and maybe even on the webinar in September.
Thank you so much, Brent, and thank you everybody again for taking time out of your day. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.